China is now demanding the immediate removal of U.S. tariffs, and China and Vietnam are currently meeting to figure out how to best harm the USA. There's also a striking TV clip that we need to watch in this context. The stock markets are currently selling off because this whole situation is bringing even more uncertainty to the market. Bitcoin is holding up quite well here. Additionally, Donald Trump just met with Bitcoin President Nayib Bukele a few minutes ago. We're looking into whether Bitcoin was discussed. We are currently seeing that the dynamics in the trade conflict are leaning more towards escalation again. It will be interesting to see if Bitcoin still reacts strongly to this. Initially, Bitcoin reacted very, very strongly to all the statements from Trump, and so on. I almost feel that Bitcoin has somewhat relaxed, and the news regarding the trade conflict doesn't impact Bitcoin as much as it does the traditional stock market. We can clearly see that. The stock market is currently correcting more downward than here. Bitcoin. However, you can see here that the risk of recession has slightly increased again after the latest reports here. But we also see a few good things here. Donald Trump actually wants to negotiate with the EU. Yes, negotiate. And it seems that things are looking quite good here. But there might be some solution. But the shocking news was that China and Vietnam are now meeting to figure out how they can harm the USA. I mean, sure, if you sell government bonds here, which is something China is already doing to some extent, you can harm the USA. They want to somehow push the 10-year government bond yields up. It has been noticed that this is probably the pressure point that hurts Donald Trump the most. But Donald Trump says here, hey, the stock market is here. Very strong after getting used to tariffs. That's what I had already mentioned a bit before. Slowly the news here doesn't shake the market as much anymore. And Donald Trump now says the market is very, very strong here. I don't want to speak of very, very strong just yet, but we definitely see that the shocks are decreasing. At the beginning, we always had big swings up and down, and the fluctuations are indeed actually decreasing a bit now. And we will also take a look at the clip shortly, here from CNBC, where it's about China demanding the immediate lifting of tariffs. And at the same time, we see the escalation that they are now teaming up with Vietnam. We'll take a look at that in a moment. But now let's briefly touch on it. The meeting between Donald Trump and the Bitcoin President Nayib Bukele, who has traveled from El Salvador to the USA for this, because he also said some very, very interesting things here. Check it out.
And we're very eager to help. We know that you have a crime problem, a terrorism problem that you need help with. And we're a small country, but if we can help, we will do it. And we actually turned the murder capital of the world, that was the journalists call it, right? Murder capital of the world, into the safest country in the Western Hemisphere.
Bukele tells Donald Trump here that they are ready to help him wherever they can. The USA had crime problems, terrorism problems. El Salvador has actually managed to transform the most dangerous country in the world into the best, safest country here in the Western Hemisphere. So, from the murder capital to the safest country, safer than parts of the USA, safer than Canada. Meanwhile, the USA now issues a smaller travel warning for El Salvador than for Germany. So, I would say Germany is more dangerous than traveling here to the USA.
And, you know, sometimes they say that we imprisoned thousands. I like to say that we actually liberated millions. So, you know, like...
It's very good. Who gave him that line? Do you think I can use that?
Yes. And what he says here is probably the biggest debate that always surrounds Nayib Bukele. Because many people, for example, now accuse him of having put so many people in prison, but Bukele sees it the other way around. Many, many millions of people can now live here in El Salvador without having to be afraid. That must also be acknowledged, because many people look at it and think, okay, there are now about 70,000 people in prison, and surely there are some. There are some who are unjustly imprisoned here. But by the way, this also happens in the USA, in Europe, in Germany as well. I mean Germany. People are also thrown into prison there for doing things that are completely irrelevant. I refer to cases like Michael Ballbeck, where it has now come out that he did nothing, or that some people should go to prison for posting memes and such. In the UK, people are also thrown into prison for retweeting government-critical things, and so on. So, we need to put this into perspective a bit. We in the West, we are not the ultra-great Democrats that we sometimes claim to be. Sure, you have to view all of this critically, but you also have to see the point that, here in El Salvador, and I am here in El Salvador, you can walk around freely now. You can leave your phone lying around anywhere, and no one will steal anything. The gangs that were criminal here are simply all gone now. You don't have to worry about anything here anymore. And that's why you can ask yourself, okay, are there really 50,000, 60,000 people who went to prison? Or were millions of people freed here?
In fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people to liberate. Yeah. But to liberate 350 million people, you have to imprison some. You know, that's the way it works, right? You cannot just, you know, free the criminals and think crime is going to go down magically. You have to imprison them so you can liberate 350 million Americans that are asking for the end of crime and the end of terrorism. And it can be done. I mean, you're doing it already. and I'm sure that people have seen the change in the streets. A long way to go because you're just initiating your second term, but it's clear that, with the numbers at the border, we need even in Democrat-run cities, they get a help from the work you're doing. So I'm really happy to be here, honored, and eager to help.
So he goes on to mention again that something similar could also happen here in the USA, that you could liberate people by putting a few people in prison. Feel free to write in the comments how you see the whole situation. I mean, I can simply say that the fact is, the situation here in El Salvador is now very, very good. And the people here are deeply grateful to Bukele for what he has done here. By the way, Bitcoin wasn't discussed here either. I specifically watched the whole thing, checked if anything about Bitcoin was mentioned or so. It's possible they talked about Bitcoin privately, but publicly, at least, to my knowledge, Bitcoin wasn't discussed here. Many had hoped that Bitcoin would be discussed here. But now let's take a look at the highly explosive clip from CNBC, where it's about China actually promoting the lifting of US tariffs. And by the way, because sometimes people write in the comments below there would share some AI fake videos or something like that. No, these are just translations from English to German using AS. And sometimes it doesn't match perfectly with the lip. 100% synchronize, but actually, the AI also synchronizes. Hear the lips?
For a closer look at China when it comes to tariffs, let's get to Eunice Yoon in Beijing. A lot going on, Eunice, regarding rare earths, visit to Vietnam, and more. Good morning.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. You guys were talking about those tariff exemptions. The Chinese government, on the whole, over the weekend, had acknowledged that the tariff exemptions were what they described as a small step, and even said that China was evaluating the impact. The state media, though, had said that this was a U.S. retreat, and also more evidence that the Chinese supply chain is really, really important for the world. Today, though, probably because of a lot of the confusion out of the messaging from the White House, the Chinese government doubled down on their overall stance. That is, that the U.S. government should abolish the tariffs and the what they describe as wrongful actions around those tariffs.
And now they are even going further, meeting with Vietnam and perhaps also with Japan, just to see. So the thing with Japan is now a conspiracy theory. I don't know if it's actually happening, but the idea is to see if they want to harm the U.S. now, because Japan also holds many U.S. government bonds, which they could potentially drop on the market. There have always been, let's say, rumors about whether China was responsible for the rise in government bond yield, or if it was Japan in combination. So it was probably both.
What was also interesting is that a state TV-linked social media account, which is now closely watched for messaging on U.S.-China trade, just several hours ago elaborated a little bit further, saying that to the Trump team, their, what they call delusion, is China will compromise under high tariffs. The account goes on saying, if the U.S. really wants to talk, China needs to see real action. What was also interesting is that the same blogger account was hinting at who would be taken, what kind of step would be taken next. And the target, they said, was American IP and American brands. And then this blogger went on to suggest that Chinese people could reject them.
So that you could just take any companies or products that are produced in the USA and partially offered in China and just drop them. And here you can see a list of potentially affected companies. Let's take a look at that.
And they said that they noted that Walt Disney and Comcast, which owns CNBC, have development and production businesses, theme parks, and consumer goods in China. They also mentioned Sony, Paramount Global, as well as Netflix. The messaging, though, overall, outside of that, and the potential for countermeasures, is that there needs to be a lot of support for Chinese exporters, and that this is paramount. Carl, you mentioned President Xi's visit to Vietnam. He is there in Southeast Asia on a three-nation tour, ostensibly to try to build up those trade ties. Today, he announced, or China and Vietnam announced that they had signed several trade negotiation deals. And then, of course, there is the private sector that is also getting involved to try to help redirect some of the goods that the exporters used to sell, and I guess so still do sell to the United States as well as elsewhere, but also to sell them here in China.
Well, I've got to tell you, Eunice, I listened to you all morning, and you've been incredibly spot on all these things. But when I listen to the rhetoric from China, this is 1968, 72 rhetoric. This is the kind of rhetoric that just says there's never going to be a meeting. Is there a way to have a Nixon to China moment? Because as far as I'm concerned, this is just right now. You're on the verge of when I was a little boy. We kept thinking, when are they going to bomb us? I mean, that was the same rhetoric. Well, when are they going to launch their nuclear weapons? I mean, that's why we used to live in fear. That's why we had cubby holes. That's why we used to put our heads in a cubby hole, because the Chinese were going to bomb us if the Russians didn't bomb us. This is the same sound.
Well, I mean, I think that the Chinese have shown that they are willing to negotiate, that they do eventually want to have some sort of meeting. But it's just that the rhetoric, I mean, you mentioned rhetoric coming out of China. The rhetoric from the Chinese perspective of the White House is not actually that helpful, because the way things are being set up is that President Trump is the kingmaker and that all these countries around the world are going over there and groveling and asking for deals. From the Chinese perspective, this cannot happen. Because for President Xi Jinping, it is so politically dangerous for him to be seen as crawling over to the United States asking for a deal.
So what can be inferred here is that it's unlikely there will be a negotiation here between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Donald Trump always says the Chinese, they want to negotiate, but they don't know how to make a deal. And that might also be because they are simply different cultures. I don't know. Maybe Xi Jinping also has too high an ego. Donald Trump, of course, also has an ego. And everyone wants the other to come crawling to them. They don't want to go crawling to the other. I have no idea. I don't know the two personally, so I can't really say much about it. In any case, we now have the situation where there is still a lot of uncertainty in the market. But as we currently see, maybe the market is not too bothered over time. Less and less. It's often like that when there's some new conflict, some war or something that breaks out. At first, the markets are still shocked. And after 3 or 4 years, the markets almost forget about it. And then it hardly affects the markets anymore. In any case, if there should be any setbacks here again, it can always be seen as a buying opportunity. You shouldn't be too panicked or anything like that here. In the long term, it always looks hyper bullish for Bitcoin. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link below for you, 21 Bitcoin. How you can buy Bitcoin easily, safely, and simply. With the code Bitcoin, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. And if you want to optimally secure your Bitcoin, I'll also include a link to the TREZOR, hardware wallet. Here you can very easily, simply keep your Bitcoin in self-responsibility and self-custody. Here, with the code Bitcoin Hotel, but written in lowercase, there's also a 10% discount. See you. Peace out.